Okay, guys, now time is 5 o'clock 29. We open the study live stream again because we have 10 hours restriction, and so let's first to find a second and it's 35th, but live streams that I haven't seen for screenshot. That's why let's begin now. See the smoke we're going. Love is nowhere to be found. See the smoke we're going. Love is nowhere to be found. See the smoke we're going down. Love is nowhere to be found. 我天！无缝衔接。
Everything looks great. All the streets are empty. Time to walk away. Thoughts without distraction. Guess I'm stuck here with me. Now I'm thinking out loud to turn the silence to sound. I'm only feeding the doubt with every word that comes out. I'm trying to shut up, but it's too late to stop. I stop thinking about me, giving up. I didn't know how to fight you. Wish I tried to. I wish I tried to be strong, but I've just given up on you. Just give it up. Just give it up. You. I wish I tried to. I wish I tried to be strong, but I've just given up on you. Just give it up. Just give it up. I've just given up on you. But it's hard to just to let you leave. When on the face, I know it's not a legacy. It's hard to leave that deep. When I'm on me, I know it's not a legacy. It's harder just to let you It's harder to I know it's not
always had when we worked on the concept of universal. So welcome to everybody, both in the room, in the freezing room, and online. My name, in case you don't know, is Luigi Zingales, and I'm the faculty director of the Stigler Center. Today, we're very happy to host a talk with Professor Benjamin Enke on the moral boundaries of political economy, where he explains how economists can study questions in morality and politics. So first of all, thank you, Ben, for taking time out of your busy schedule for this relevant and timely conversation, and we look forward to your insights. Before we begin, I would like to highlight a few other upcoming events. So on October 16, I look forward to publicly present my recent co-author paper, The Conflict of Interest Discount in the Marketplace of Ideas, at a live webinar hosted by the Center. On October 30th, the Center will host a live online recording of our podcast, Capital Isn't, which I co-host with Bethany McLean, where we will chat with the acclaimed author and historian, Sir Neil Ferguson. On October 31st, just ready for Halloween, join us for an event with Kartik Ramana and both John Paul Rollard as they discuss Kartik's new book, The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World. Feel free to check our website for more details, as well as our publication, promarket.org, and also remember to subscribe to our Capitalism podcast. This Thursday's episode features an Ask Me Anything mailbag, where Bethany and I answer listeners' questions about what does and often does not work in capitalism today. Before we begin, please note that we are on the record live streaming and we'll post the event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for Ben, we'll have time at the end, so please wait and for the Microsoft to pass by so everybody can listen to your brilliant questions. As usual, the views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And now, please allow me for a very brief introduction of our speaker. Benjamin Enke is the Paul Sack Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at Harvard University. His research focuses on experimental, behavioral, cultural, and political economy. Recent work focuses on boundary rationality and the effects of culture on economic decision-making. Today, Ben will highlight how the analytical toolkit of economics has facilitated progress in the study of morality and politics, thus illuminating a wide range of important issues such as voter behavior, policy preferences, and beyond. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you all for coming. I would like to get us started by considering 3 quotes, some of which you might have come across because they've become famous over the years. The first one is by Peter Singer. Peter Singer, many of you will know him, is the founder of the so-called effective altruism movement. And one of his most famous writings, The Expanding Circle in the early 80s, asserts that, I'm going to read this out to you, the circle of altruism has broadened from the family and tribe to the nation and race, and we are beginning to recognize that our obligations extend to all human beings. That statement became famous because what Singer was doing here, of course, was not just making a descriptive argument. He wasn't just saying people's circle of altruism has become wider. Instead, he's making a normative statement. He's saying we have obligations to other human beings, and those obligations have extended beyond people of the same nation and race. Now contrast or compare this statement with a second quote that I put up here for you, which is more closely related to the political domain, which is by a famous left-wing philosopher, Gilles Deleuze. He was a very famous left-wing intellectual in France in the 80s. And at some point on public television, he was interviewed. He was asked, Gilles, you're one of the most famous left-wing intellectuals that we have here in France. But can you actually tell us what it means for you to be left-wing? And so what's your definition of being politically left? And now, to everyone's surprise at the time, he did not say something like, to be on the left means to care for the poor and tax the rich or something like that. Instead, he cared he said, to be from the left means to know that the third world's issues are closer to us than our neighborhood's issues. Let's reinterpret that statement slightly. I mean, take it literally, it's maybe a little bit too extreme. We don't care about people that are very far away from us more than people in our neighborhood. But let's say what Deleuze really tried to say is we care about people far away from us as much as about our neighbors. And that's our definition of being left-wing. Now, in that sense, that statement is very closely related to the expanding circle of altruism that Singer here alludes to. Now, contrast those two statements with a famous quote by the former UK Prime Minister Theresa May in the wake of Brexit in 2016. She went on the record saying, "If you believe you are a citizen of the world, if you are Peter Singer, if you're a citizen of nowhere, many people feel the strongest sense of solidarity with those who share their history, language, and common culture." So today's talk will be devoted to studying the question how we can make sense of these moral statements from the perspective of economics, how we can use the analytical toolkit that economics provides us to understand how these types of moral viewpoints can be measured and how they affect economic and political decision-making. Now, to do that, it's often helpful to just define, verbally what we mean when we talk about heterogeneous moral viewpoints. So here we're going to think of a continuum of moral systems that we're going to label as varying along a continuum between universalism and particularism, where universalism basically refers to an impersonal morality, where you treat everybody equally. It doesn't matter whether someone is your friend or your neighbor or a relative or whether they live in a faraway country. You treat everybody equally. There's a sense of impartiality. There are no place-based identity. That's sort of the moral stance behind universalism. In particular, notice that most of the values that people commonly associate with universalism. So, for example, you would never say, be just to your brother. You would say, be just. So in that sense, justice is a universalist moral principle. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, we're going to locate what we call particularism, often also referred to as communitarian or communal morality, according to which people favor people like us and exhibit relationship or group-specific values like loyalty. Right? So, for example, just purely semantically, it doesn't make sense for you to say, be loyal. It only makes sense to say, be loyal to your family, be loyal to your country, be loyal to your institution, whatever it is. But these are relationship-specific, group-specific values. Now, everybody exhibits universalist tendencies and particularist tendencies to some degree. So I don't want you to think of this as a 0-1 classification. But people are going to differ in the relative weight they place on moral principles that are related to universalism and particularism, and we will be interested in measuring this heterogeneity. But we're not going to think of it as, Luigi is a universalist and Ben is a particularist. Instead, there's going to be a continuum with different weights on those two. And now what's going to be important for the rest of the discussion today is that I, as a researcher, as a social scientist, I'm not only interested in measuring these objects and using them to understand economic and political behavior or trying to understand where this heterogeneity comes from in the first place, but I'm never going to impose my own moral viewpoints on the discussion. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is a purely positive study of how heterogeneity in morality matters for economics and politics, but I'm not going to engage in any type of normative reasoning about what is objectively right or wrong. Okay, I'm not a philosopher. So now what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through two lines of research that I've developed over the last couple of years that basically make the case that economics and morality are intimately linked, that they are deeply intertwined in two conceptually distinct but interrelated ways. The first is the claim that a large share of the political disagreement that we see in the Western world, both in the US and in Western Europe, but also in countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, a large share of that political disagreement, including on economic issues, resides from heterogeneity in basic moral values. So we're going to, break up this notion that left versus right-wing politics is mostly about, tax the rich and redistribute to the poor, and instead we're going to reconceptualize much of the political disagreement that we see as resulting from heterogeneity in moral values along the lines that I've already discussed. And now, just for you to see that this is true intuitively, consider policy domains like immigration, support for minorities and affirmative action, foreign aid, globalist policies like the integration policies of the European Union. All of these policies somehow, implicitly or explicitly, involve trade-offs between the welfare of in-group members and out-group members. And we're going to see how people's moral views shape their policy views and their resulting voting behavior on these issues. So that's going to be the first claim. The second claim then is that the moral values that are prevalent in society at any given point in time themselves depend on the economic incentives that are in place. In particular, we're going to think of moral values that people have as a functional response to a certain economic need. We're going to think of moral values as being the outcome of an economic system that incentivizes a certain morality. So we're going to talk about the idea how, impersonal markets or loose kinship structures, I'll explain all of that as we move on, how these, social institutions foster a universalist morality, whereas other institutions, like community-based cooperation rules, for example, foster a particularist morality. So now what I want you to take away from this list here is that we're going to think of morality both as an explanatory variable. It allows us to understand where political disagreement comes from, how it is shaped, and how it can potentially be resolved. But then on the other hand, we're also going to study, well, how does the economic system, how do social institutions that are shaped by heterogeneity and morality, how do those in turn feed back into the values people hold in the first place? Now, not much of what I'm going to discuss today is going to rely on theories, on hypotheses that other social scientists, in particular moral psychologists and evolutionary anthropologists, have put forward over the years. So much of the quote-unquote theorizing that you'll see today is not new. What I'm going to do as economists, I'm going to import those hypotheses from the other social scientists and test them at scale or in the wild. Okay, so that's sort of my part of the production here in the grand scheme of the social sciences. Okay, so the talk is going to be structured in basically 4 steps, where the first 3 are going to be devoted to understanding how can we actually measure this heterogeneity in morality, and how can we link it to our political decision-making, to voting behavior within the US, but also more generally across the globe. And then finally, we'll talk about cross-cultural variation in morality and the economic origins of that variation. Okay, so let me start by talking about what's perhaps the most obvious starting point when one thinks about heterogeneity in morality, which is, well, how do moral psychologists think about these issues? How do they conceptualize, how do they measure this heterogeneity? Now, one prominent approach in moral psychology to thinking about these questions is a framework that was constructed by a group of psychologists led by Jonathan Haidt and Jess Graham, called moral foundations theory. The moral foundations theory is a very nice example of how psychologists think about the measurement of morality. Now, the way they think about the measurement of morality is that people's moral values reflect their normative beliefs, their beliefs about what is objectively right and wrong. And here you see an example of this from the so-called Moral Foundations questionnaire that they constructed to measure this heterogeneity, which reads, this is just one of the questions that shows up in this questionnaire. When you decide whether something is right or wrong, then to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking? A, whether or not some people were treated differently than others. You indicate your agreement with this statement on a scale from 0 to 10 or something. Second, whether or not someone showed a lack of loyalty. Again, you indicate your agreement or your disagreement. Now, obviously, that's a pretty universalist statement. That's a particularist statement. And now, the Moral Foundations questionnaire basically contains a long list of survey items like this. But the whole survey was basically designed to illuminate heterogeneity along this universalism, particularism cleavage that we're going to be interested in today. And now what's interesting for us from the perspective of doing quantitative social science with this framework is that, one, there's going to be a very interesting large-scale data set available that classifies people along this universalism, particularism continuum using the Moral Foundations questionnaire. That's going to be number 1. We have access to really large-scale survey data. And 2, the Moral Foundations questionnaire comes with a so-called Moral Foundations dictionary that tells us what type of language is associated with a universalist or a particularist morality. And that's going to come in handy because obviously we're not just interested in quantifying the morality of people that we can easily target with surveys. Ideally, we'd also like to be able to quantify the morality of politicians that we cannot survey. I cannot send this survey to Kamala Harris and ask her to complete it because she's just never going to get back to me. So we need to infer her moral type, her latent moral type, using more indirect methods, and for that, text analysis is going to come in. So one side note that's important for you to appreciate the richness of moral psychology, but also the ways in which economists think about things a little bit differently than psychologists, is if you talk to any given psychologist or even moral psychologist, about moral foundations theory or about, in general, psychologists' approach to measuring morality, you will get into very heated debates very quickly. So there's, just like in economics, there's massive disagreement about the details, about how one should measure moral values, how many moral dimensions there are exactly. But it also turns out to be true that everybody in the field agrees on the broad distinction that I'm drawing here between universalism and particularism. Just like within economics, we have massive debates about everything, but if a psychologist asks us, do you believe in incentives, everybody's going to be like this. Okay? So that's the analogy here. And what that means for me as an economist working with this type of data is that I'm going to ignore the huge fraction of the nuances that psychologists impose on these frameworks. Instead, I'm only going to compute, in a sense, from the questionnaire that is at my disposal here, I'm going to compute an index, a one-dimensional index. How universalist versus particularist are you? Psychologists, if you taught them about this, they would freak out. They would say, "Oh my God, but morality has more than these, this one dimension. It's not just one dimensional; it's 4 or 5 dimensional." But what I'm saying is, to simplify, as economists, we don't care about psychological details. We can just collapse the whole framework into a one-dimensional index, and you will see it has massive explanatory power. And the same we'll do when we conduct text analyses, which is we're just going to construct an index at the level of each individual text, which tells us, well, how universalist is that text relative to how many particularist or communal words. So now, the reason why I'm stressing the one-dimensional nature of this index is that it allows us to visualize the spatial heterogeneity that we get in the US very neatly. And now, what I'm showing you here is a data set that's very interesting. It was constructed by John Haidt and his collaborators. So Haidt is a psychologist at NYU Stern, and he's pretty famous. So when they constructed the Moral Foundations questionnaire back in the days, this was almost 20 years ago, they put that questionnaire on their website, which is called www.yourmorals.org. You can go check it out. You can complete the questionnaire on that website and get feedback on how your moral values compare to those of others. So they put this questionnaire online and got a lot of press coverage because of the interactive nature of this tool. So that over the years, tens of thousands of people completed the questionnaire on Haidt's website. And now, of course, that sample is self-selected. It's not representative, nationally representative in any meaningful sense of the word. It skews young, relatively well-educated, as you can imagine. But what's neat about it is that it's of such massive scale that we can construct non-representative, but still we can construct county averages for many of the counties in the US. So what you see here is, again, this one-dimensional index at display where lighter values, values that are white or light yellow mean higher universalism, and darker red means higher particularism. Okay, and gray means there's just not enough data available from that county for us to be able to draw meaningful inferences about the average values in that region. So notice, most of these counties that are gray here are sparsely populated. Now, what you see here is that this variation, one, makes intuitive sense, right? So you see high degrees of universalism, for example, here in large parts of the Northeast, but then also in parts of California, and then higher degrees of particularism as population density declines towards the the middle of the country, and then also further to the south. That's the first main takeaway, which is this variation seems to make intuitive sense. But the second very interesting aspect when you look at this map is the massive amount of heterogeneity that you see here, even within. Oh, that's fine. Is the massive amount of heterogeneity that you see here, even within states, even within relatively narrowly defined commuting zones. So now that's important for us because it's going to allow us to construct analyses that don't compare, some county here in the Northeast with a county down in Florida. Instead, we're going to link this heterogeneity, this spatial heterogeneity, moral values to voting outcomes. We're going to be comparing neighboring adjacent counties that differ in their moral values and then potentially also in their vote shares. So we're holding more things fixed at a time. So now, just for you to get a feel for how this spatial heterogeneity on the voter side links to heterogeneity across politicians, what I'm showing you here is the time series of language in the US Congress. So what you see here is, again, a one-dimensional index on the y-axis, which is the relative frequency of universalist and particularist terminology across all Democrats and Republicans in Congress after World War II. So every single word that was ever publicly uttered in the Congress is in this data set. And higher values mean a higher relative frequency of universalist terminology. So what are the interesting takeaways here? One, by the way, this paper I wrote in 2016, so that's why the trend line stops here. But there are two interesting takeaways here. One, democratic politicians, on average, use more universalist speech than Republicans. Two, that gap has clearly widened over the years. And three, there seems to be some breakpoint here in the late 90s, where the massive increase in universalism that we've seen since World War II seems to be reversing. But again, what I want you to notice is that these patterns make intuitive sense. And so at this point, we're just validating this data. These make intuitive sense in the sense that universalism is higher among the Democrats. That seems to resonate intuitively. But then also this massive increase in average universalism for both Republicans and Democrats, that seems to make intuitive sense when we recognize that the point at which this starts, which is basically the mid-60s, and so the US Civil Rights Act was passed here, that many universalist movements have taken place since then. And so think about the women's movement or people, the foreign aid movement, and many universalist movements have taken place in the second part of the 20th century, and we see this reflected in this. So now when you look at this map, the map I showed you on the previous slide, in combination with what you see here, it immediately raises the question, well, to what extent does spatial heterogeneity in universalism allow us to predict voting behavior? Because apparently, if you just think about it from a simple supply and demand framework, from the perspective of a simple supply and demand framework, then what we see here is basically politicians are supplying a certain type of morality, and voters demand a certain type of morality, potentially. And then is it actually true that those voters who are more universalist are more likely to vote for the more universalist party, for the more universalist politicians? So that's what I'm going to show you on the next slide here, which is the correlation between the map I showed you earlier. That's the county-level universalism map on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the county-level democratic vote share. The correlation is about 0.5. And now what I need you to notice here when you look at this correlation plot is that one, we can construct this either just looking at the raw correlation, or we can construct it in the ways I described earlier by comparing adjacent counties. In fact, it looks exactly the same. Okay, so much of this heterogeneity that you see here does not reflect, comparing Massachusetts with Ohio, but instead within Massachusetts, some counties happen to be the more densely populated ones happen to be more universalist than some adjacent counties. So that's number one. That's important to notice about this result. Number two is, what's often emphasized in the discussion of voting outcomes by economists is the explanatory power of economic variables in predicting election outcomes. So for example, what economists routinely do is they link, county-level democratic vote shares to average or median income, to education rates, and so on. So if you do that, you get significant correlations. That's true, but they are almost an order of a magnitude smaller than the one that you see here. For example, the correlation between household income, median household income, and voting Democratic hovers around 0.1. Okay, this one is 0.5. So here we're talking about something that, in a correlational sense, seems to give us a lot of explanatory power that traditional economic variables miss. So now, what I would like to talk with you about next is basically the question of how can we move beyond this psychological conception of morality and think about morality more from an economic perspective. And here from an economic perspective, I mean from the perspective of money, right? Because one way to think about these psychological questionnaires is that they are extremely effective at tapping into people's moral intuitions. They are very cleverly phrased in ways that appeal to people to reveal their moral values, their deep instincts, but they are not revealed preference measures. They are just measures of, self-reported measures of intuitions. So as an economist, you may ask, well, is there a way in which we can measure morality in a more incentivized way, using money, hard outcomes, behavior? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reconceptualize the discussion through the lens of a very simple model. I'm not going to show you any equations, but this figure here is going to illustrate in a very neat way what we're going to try to do when we reconceptualize heterogeneity in morality along the universalism versus particularism continuum using economic tools. So what I'm showing you here is a figure where you can think of the x-axis as some version of some abstract notion of social distance. How socially distant are you from a potential beneficiary, a potential recipient of a pro-social act of yours? Right, so you can imagine that this is you, this is your mom, that's your sibling, that's your best friend, that's your neighbor, that's someone you've recently interacted with. and that's someone you've never met before, or who lives, in a different country, has a different ethnicity, a different language, different values, and so on. But think of this, loosely speaking, as social distance. Now, the y-axis shows how pro-social you are toward that individual, how much you care about that individual. So then we're just going to reconceptualize the discussion we had earlier by defining a full universalist as someone who does not care at all whether they interact with their mom here or whether they interact with a stranger from another part of the world here. That's full universalism. You're fully flat. Okay? Now, a particularistic morality, a communal morality, on the other hand, mandates that you treat your mom, your neighbor, your friends, and so on very well, but you don't care as much about people who are far away from you, socially or geographically. Now, notice what I've done here is I've constructed this figure such that the overall level of morality that these two individuals here exhibit is held constant. I've just reallocated mass from here to here, but the overall area under these two curves here, which you can think of as the overall level of morality, the overall level of altruism that these two individuals exhibit, is exactly the same. So we're not saying that universalists are more or less moral than particularists. We're just saying everything else equal, a universalist is going to be nicer to a stranger, and a particularist is going to be a nicer neighbor to have. Okay, so particularists are great friends and neighbors to have. Universalists are great strangers to encounter. That's the idea. And now the question for us is going to be, you can basically see that this is a model. I mean, I'm not showing you any equations, but you can see how this is a model that one can, in principle, estimate. And our objective is going to be, how can we actually estimate this from monetary data? How can I use data on financial flows to estimate heterogeneity in the US, say across congressional districts or across counties, in the slope of this function? Where we're going to say a US district is going to be very universalist if they donate as much to their neighbor as to some faraway place. Now, the way in which we're going to do this is we're going to leverage data, donations data from Donors Choose, which is a charity website in the US. It's pretty widely known. It's focused on funding or providing funding for public schools. So the way in which it works is that teachers upload their projects, which are basically requests for funding. For example, a teacher may say, I want to take my kids to the zoo. I need $500. You put that request online, and then the website, after the school has registered, the website verifies the teacher's identity and provides a bit of background information about the school and the local circumstances. For example, what fraction of the kids gets free lunch, what's the ethnic composition of the neighborhood, who's the teacher, and so on. And then what's really interesting about this website is that you cannot donate to the website as such. You need to select an individual project that you would like to fund. Okay. So now let me show you how this works. This is the Donors Choose functionality. So here you see a range of projects that are offered to you, where you can select one of them or potentially multiple of them to contribute funding. And up here you have search fields where you can enter certain keywords. Say you only want to donate to a place in California, or you only want to donate to causes that involve going to the zoo, or you only want to donate to causes that involve getting computers or something like this. You just put it up here and the projects appear. Now, Donors Choose is very popular in the US. 82% of all public schools are active on this website. And the data set we managed to get a hold of, it's not the full Donors Choose data set, but it's a large chunk of it. It involves 1.2 million projects that cover about $520 million in donations. And we're going to work with this to quantify the universalism of districts in the US. This is going to be interesting for our purposes because many of the donations on this website, contrary to what one might perhaps intuitively expect, do not just go to the local neighborhood school. So it's not just parents going on the website and funding the school of their own kids. That's surely part of it, but 2/3 of all donations on this website are outside of a radius of 20 miles around the donor's zip code, which suggests that a large share of these donations are to schools that the donor has no personal connection to. So now, what we're going to try to do then is we're going to try to estimate this function here, what I showed you earlier, which is we're not going to ask which district donates more than another one. We're not going to be interested in that. We're only going to be interested in the question, towards whom does any given district donate? Does any given district donate primarily to the local neighborhood school, but not so much to schools that are far away? Or is this a district that donates equally to the local neighborhood school and to schools far away? Okay, that's going to be our definition of universalism. We're never interested in how much do you donate. That's affected by many factors, of course. Is the district rich or poor? We're not interested in that. That's taken out of the equation. It's only about the relative giving behavior. Towards whom do you give? So let me show you an illustration of this for two districts from the state of California, where I'm showing you a binned scatter plot. So you can think of this as basically summarizing the evidence on the donations that we see in these two districts from California. But I need you to understand that these are not individual donations. So not each of these dots is an individual donor. Instead, each of these dots averages across a large number of donations. So you can think of each dot as representing roughly 600 donations. So now what it shows you is that for each of these two districts, the amount of donations, expressed in logs, as a function of the geographic distance, again in logs, between the donor and the recipient. Because the donors choose data set has a nice feature, which is why we use it, that we observe the zip code of the donor and the zip code of the recipient school. So we can directly match the donor to the school and evaluate the distance between them. So now what you see here is basically one district that's relatively universalist in the sense that this district donates as much to schools that are nearby as to schools in the neighboring states, as to schools at the other end of the country. Whereas this district here donates much more to schools that are reasonably close and then less to schools that are very far. Now that's one example. Let me show you a second one, which is going to leverage a very interesting aspect of this approach, of this data set too, which is that here what we're looking at is how does donations behavior vary as a function of geographic distance. Okay? But now you can think of social distance that we've talked about earlier as being very multidimensional. It's not just that if you're a universalist, you are potentially invariant to geographic distance, you're potentially also invariant to values distance or income distance or friendship distance or God knows what. So what we would ideally like to have as social scientists is a summary measure of social distance that doesn't just tell us how far is this school here away, how far is this donor away from this school geographically, but socially as a summary index of how distant, how dissimilar the donor and the recipient school are. Now, fortunately, Facebook data give us just that. So Facebook developed an index of social distance, of friendship distance between any two districts in the US. So this is a measure that basically gives you the probability that any two randomly selected Facebook users from two different districts are friends on Facebook. And then the friendship distance between two districts is said to be large if the probability that two randomly selected people on Facebook are friends, if that probability is very small. So again, what you see here is an illustration of this. The x-axis is friendship distance. And you see two districts from the state of New York, one that's very universalist, where people in this district donate as much to schools that are very close, friendship-wise, where people have many friends. It's not necessarily geographically close, but it's close in friendship space. You have many friends in these schools here, but they donate as much to schools where they don't know anyone, where they don't have any friends. This district, on the other hand, people donate much more to places where they have many friends, but very little to places where they don't have any friends. So again, this is just a different way of saying what I emphasized earlier, which is that these universalist districts here, in a sense, are great strangers to encounter, but terrible friends to have, whereas the particularists are great neighbors and friends to have, but terrible strangers to encounter, just by definition, by construction of this measure. So now you can imagine that this analysis that I'm showing you here, you run it for every single district in the US. Okay, so that gives us a measure, an economic measure of how universalist this district is in terms of these public school donations. So we're going to define the district's level of universalism as the slope of this function. You're fully universalist if the line looks like this. You're fully particularist if this line, roughly speaking, looks like that. So then what I'm showing you here on the next slide is the resulting map of universalism that results from these educational expenditures, where dark blue now means higher universalism and lighter color means lower universalism. So this is at the district level. Now what's amazing is that this map here, which is constructed based on monetary donations on this, Donors Choose website, and the map I showed you earlier, which is based on an entirely different data set, psychological data on do people agree with certain moral values judgments. The correlation between this map and the map I showed you earlier is 0.65. Even though they're constructed from very different data sources, using very different techniques, there seems to be some common element here that drives this variation. And now we see that again when we link this measure of universalism to voting behavior. This here is the correlation between this economic measure of district universalism and democratic vote shares. This is in House races, but you get the same in presidential races. The correlation is about 0.5. And again, what you can do is you can look at this in the aggregate, pooling across all districts in the country, or you just look at it within states, within state variation, comparing adjacent districts, you still get the same. So now, the takeaway from what I've shown you so far is basically that within the US, we can measure universalism in different ways using aggregate data, large-scale psychological questionnaires, donations data, and use it to predict political behavior. So now we're going to assess, is this something that's somehow specific to the US, or is this something that we see everywhere globally? So to get at this, we cannot rely on donations data because the types of high-quality donations data that I just presented to you, that's not available for every country. Instead, we entered a collaboration with the Gallup World Poll. So many of you will have heard of Gallup. It's the leading multinational polling company in the world, and they conduct what they refer to as the annual World Poll, which surveys a representative sample of citizens in each country on this planet about social and economic issues. Sample size in small countries is about 1,000 people, in large countries it's about 2,000. And these are professional, highly trained enumerators. Okay, so these interviews take place through Gallup's professional survey infrastructure, meaning they either use face-to-face interviews, where they basically have techniques, random techniques, random door-to-door techniques to sample people, or they use random dialing techniques for telephone interviews. So then effectively, we purchased survey time from Gallup to survey people about their universalism in 60 countries where the data is going to involve about 64,000 respondents. So how did we measure universalism? We wanted to do it in ways that are similar to, that are related to the donations measure that you saw earlier, but in a way that we can actually implement in a hypothetical survey. Right? So in a survey like this, we cannot ask people to donate actual money because we cannot implement these payments. We cannot send money across the payment. Sorry, we cannot send money across the country to different recipients. Instead, we're going to implement the same type of measurement, but in a hypothetical fashion. So to see how this works, we ask people to participate in a hypothetical money allocation task that involves in-group members and strangers. So we ask them a series of questions. I've listed 2 examples here. One is, how would you split $100 between a friend and a random stranger? You can split the money any way you see fit, but you can't keep any of the money for yourself. You have to split it up between these 2 individuals. So of course, the fully universalist thing to do is you split the money 50-50, but then on the other end, sure enough, you care more about your friend than about the random stranger, so maybe you end up splitting the money 80-20 or something like this. But this gives us an index of how universalist you are when a trade-off between a random stranger and a friend is involved. And then we have an entire series of questions where we vary the identity of these in-group and out-group members, so we get a more comprehensive picture of people's morality that's not just specific to this particular group of friend versus stranger. For example, I put the same one here. Oh, well, that was a little. So, for example, we also ask people, how would you split $100 between a neighbor and a random stranger? How would you split $100 between someone who shares your same ethnic background and a random stranger? How do you split $100 between someone from your country and a random stranger from another country, and so on? And so we always vary the identity of the in-group and out-group member, but the overall objective is always the same, which is we aim to construct an overall summary index of how universalist you are in these types of monetary allocations. Now, and then this global survey that Gallup conducted also includes a range of policy questions where we elicit people's views on redistribution, immigration, military, and so on. So now we're going to ask, how does this, how do these data allow us to predict people's policy views, and is that more or less the same in the US as it is in Europe or in other parts of the world? So before we get to the policy questions, let me show you this map. We will get back to this later when we talk about cross-cultural variation and universalism. I just want to flag it for now, for you to see that the variation that we are interested in here is ultimately across individuals. Right? We'll be comparing individuals from the same country that differ in their universalism and link it to their policy views. But also this data set, of course, which is now publicly available, also has this cross-cultural component to it because we can compute country averages or state-level averages or whatever it is that you want to compute. So now, in terms of explaining people's policy views, what you see here is the correlation between the universalism that we derive from these hypothetical money allocation tasks and their views on whether the government should be more strongly involved in reducing income inequality. So this is basically the standard survey measure targeted at measuring support for redistribution. And now, again, this is a binned scatter plot. So this is not literally, these are 50 dots, but these are not 50 respondents that you see here. Instead, we're talking about, each of these policy questions was completed by around 20,000 respondents. So each of these dots here averages across hundreds of individuals. Okay. And now what you see is that the higher universalism, the more people support redistribution. Where, again, we are comparing people from the same country who differ in their universalism. Now, this is pooled in the global sample, and as we move on, I will show you how this variation, this predictive power of universalism, potentially varies across cultures, whether it's the same in the US as in Germany, or Kenya, or China. Now, next one, this is the correlation between universalism and support for what you may think of as foreign aid, where people are asked, do you think we should rather support the poor in other countries? Should we send money abroad to support the poor, or should we rather support the poor in our own country? It's a classical trade-off in moral philosophy. Who do we owe who do we have moral obligations towards? Is it poor children in Africa, or is it poor children in the US? Right? Poor children in Africa are arguably more needy, but poor children in the US are somehow closer to us. So what you see is a huge correlation between this index of universalism and support for foreign aid. Now, next one, this is support for what you may think of as global climate change prevention. So the ways in which people prioritize preventing global climate change versus just focusing on the local environment. Again, that's strongly predicted by universalism. Now, the message I want to get across by flipping through these different figures here, I have more, I'm not going to show you all of them, but the message I'm going to try to get across here is that many policies that you conventionally think of as left-wing, that many of these policies have a very universalist flavor. So, for example, when we think of redistribution, we often mean a very impersonal type of redistribution. Right? So we mean redistribution that's implemented by the federal government, where the government taxes money away from Ben. Ben lives in Boston, and sends it to someone in Kansas that Ben has no personal connection to. That's a very universalist way of thinking about redistribution. Over the course of human history, for the most part, we've been subjected to redistributive systems that work very differently, where Ben also got taxed, but the money was not redistributed to people he has no connection to, but instead it was redistributed within the neighborhood, within the community, within the clan, which is a much more particularist way of thinking about redistribution. And in fact, what we then did in these surveys here is we didn't just ask people, how much do you support redistribution at the federal level, which is what this question captures, but instead we asked them, well, how much would you support redistribution if it doesn't take place at the national level, but instead if it takes place at the local level? So the money that gets taxed away from you potentially is only redistributed within the local community in which it was based. And then what you see is that the standard partisan differences in support for redistribution essentially break down. So much of the partisan differences in support for redistribution that do not reflect that conservatives are fundamentally opposed to redistribution, but that they are opposed to this impersonal universalist system of redistribution that we have put in place. Okay. Let me turn to the cultural specificity of these results, right? Because in everything that you've seen so far, we've pooled the data across all of the 60 countries in the sample, right? So the 60,000 respondents across all of the countries. And now what I'm going to show you is what's the correlation between universalism and these different policy views in different groups of countries. And here we're going to distinguish between countries that the cultural psychologists call rich, weird countries. So the cultural psychologists like to crack jokes. What they mean when they say rich, weird is where's weird here? Rich, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That's what the cultural psychologists call weird. So that's the first group of countries we're going to look at. The second group of countries is you're also rich, but not weird, as the cultural psychologists would say. So think South Korea, Japan, Israel. And then lower middle income countries are the third bucket. Now here, each dot shows you the link between universalism and the political outcomes we've discussed, where here we're looking at reducing income inequality. This is foreign aid. This is global climate change prevention. This is views on immigration. And what you see is that these links are always much more pronounced in the rich West compared to outside the West. In fact, if you look at the lower middle income countries, the correlations are still present sometimes, but for the most part, they break down. So what this suggests to us is that indeed, the strong explanatory power that these moral views have on people's political views, on their voting behavior, they seem to be something that is relatively specific to the rich West. In fact, this is not just an income effect, right? So even if you go to countries that are still very rich, South Korea, Japan, Israel, the correlations become much smaller. So now a question that we haven't been able to figure out yet is, well, what drives this cultural specificity? Why is it that these moral views are much more predictive of policy views and voting behavior in the rich West compared to outside the West? Okay, so now, just to conclude this part of the discussion, I've tried to convince you that we can measure universalism in very different ways. We can do it by relying on large-scale psychological questionnaires. We can do it by relying on large-scale donations data within the US. We can use, global surveys that rely on hypothetical money allocation tasks. And we've also seen analyses that rely on textual data, where we classified the language of politicians. But regardless of what exactly the data set is that we look at, and regardless of what the technique is that we deploy to estimate universalism, we've always seen the same pattern, which is that higher universalism leads to more support for left-wing policies and politicians, either in terms of policy views or voting behavior. So that's the first main takeaway I would like you to walk away with from this talk. That economists can measure these types of moral constructs at the aggregate level, across counties, across districts, even across countries, and link them to policy outcomes. So that leads me to the second part of the talk, which is going to focus on the other side of the coin, which is, well, if moral values help us to understand how social, political, and economic outcomes emerge, such as views on redistribution, then how do economic incentives potentially feed back? How do social institutions potentially feed back into the moral views that people hold in the first place? So this is a discussion that's going to be based on a very interesting literature outside of economics in the evolutionary sciences that basically centers on the question, where does heterogeneity in morality come from? And now it turns out, once you consider the question, where does heterogeneity in morality come from? Why are some people universalists and some are particularists? Then almost inevitably, you get to a question that's even deeper, one level deeper, because you need to ask yourself, well, where does morality come from in the first place? Why is it that we as human beings, that we care so extraordinarily strongly about something that we consider morally right or wrong? Right? So why do we have these strong moral gut instincts? Why do we even have biological reactions? Right? So why do we have emotions that tell us that something is morally right or wrong? So the most popular theory of the evolution of morality in the social sciences, that's dominant across evolutionary psychology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology, is basically that the reason why we have evolved moral values, moral beliefs, and emotions like guilt and shame that we think of as moral emotions, the reason why we've evolved those is for basically functional, economic, and social reasons. So the argument is that there's a fundamental problem that mankind has to solve at some level, which is the problem of cooperation, which is humans cannot be successful individually. They need to work together in groups to achieve their desired goals. And so back in the days when we were still hunter-gatherers, we had to cooperate to hunt. We had to cooperate to ensure survival. Today, we also cooperate, but in different ways. We cooperate by participating in anonymous markets, by participating in large-scale institutions. But the fundamental problem that humankind faces, just like any other species, is we need to somehow cooperate, and this is what economists call, social dilemmas. We need to cooperate in situations where we could behave selfishly. Right? So if my tribe gets attacked by a lion, I could act selfishly. I could run away, make sure that I survive, but that would endanger the potential survival of the group. So then the argument is humans have evolved moral values to induce them to cooperate in social dilemmas, to not run away when the lion attacks, to not cheat on your trading partner when you participate in a market in our modern society. So a different way of saying this is that evolutionary researchers believe that moral values are a type of psychological police. I really like this expression. It's a psychological police because it's internal to you, but it basically monitors your behavior. If you behave in ways that your biological system considers immoral, you will even have biological reactions. You will feel hot in front of others, shame. So this economic functionalist thinking is extremely interesting because this is thinking that was largely developed outside of economics, right? But this is a deeply economic argument. Right, so these evolutionary researchers essentially say, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit now, but they essentially say the reason why we have moral values is economics. These aren't economists. So now we're going to use that line of reasoning to investigate a little bit, well, where does cultural variation in morality come from in the first place? And now the starting point for that analysis is going to be the very simple observation that if it's true that morality serves some economic purpose, which is to enforce cooperation, to make people behave pro-socially in situations where they could run away from the line, where they could cheat on their trading partner, if that's the ultimate objective of morality, then it should be true, almost by definition, that morality changes as the prevailing economic incentives change. In particular, when we go back to the distinction between a universalist and a particularist morality, it should be that if the prevailing economic system is such that people cooperate in a repeated fashion locally with people they know, then it should be that that environment, a more particularist morality evolves because that is the morality that you need given these economic circumstances. Right? So for example, if you live as part of a group that has very little interactions with outsiders, where your economic and social success in life depend on being nice to your friends and neighbors and extended family, then there's no functional reason for you to develop a universalist morality. If, on the other hand, you live in an economic system that, comprises many one-shot anonymous interactions, say the large-scale anonymous markets that we have in our society, then a more universalist morality may be more productive to entertain. So then now we're going to use this broad idea that there should be cross-cultural variation in morality along this universalism, particularism dimension, depending on the local incentives, depending on the local economic structure that's in place. Okay, so now we're going to investigate this in two different ways. First, by studying the structure of extended family systems, historical extended family systems, and then in the second step, by studying the role that markets play in shaping people's moral values. Okay, so let's talk about extended family systems, kinship systems first. because it turns out that this is a type of social institution that many historians, anthropologists, and psychologists tell us is very important, potentially, for shaping the ways in which people interact with each other, economically and socially, and hence may also shape their moral values. So the basic idea here is that both historically, largely historically, but also to some extent today, societies differed widely in terms of their basic social structure, whether they entertain very tight, strong, extended family relationships. So today in the US, obviously, we cherish a social structure where people live in nuclear families, and these are highly prized, and we have relatively weak social ties to extended families, and we've never heard of clans, for example. But for the most part of history, and certainly in many parts of the world, if we just go back 100 or 200 years, in many places we saw extended kinship systems that played a large role in society in terms of structuring social and economic cooperation, where people live with their parents after marriage, where they identify with clans, where they marry their cousins. These are all indications of strong extended kinship networks. And now the idea is going to be, well, if for some reason a society evolves a tight kinship structure, then that should, that should come with a particularist morality too. Because if you're part of such, a tight extended family system that emphasizes economic cooperation within clans, for example, then what you need to make the system work is a particularist morality, not a universalist morality. If, on the other hand, you grow up in a society that, basically emphasizes loose kinship relations, where people interact with strangers outside of their extended kinship system, family, outside of their clan, then we should expect these people to evolve more universalist values. And now this is a paper I wrote a couple of years ago, and I'm only going to show you one picture from this paper, which is going to be, unfortunately, the most superficial picture in the entire paper, but it's also the most the simplest one to explain and to understand. And then I'll sketch out to you a little bit how in the paper I go deeper, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to sketch this part.
Hello.
So what we need now, if we believe in this argument, is we need a measure of the tightness of historical kinship ties. We need a measure of the strength of extended kinship relations. So here, what we're going to rely on is the so-called ethnographic atlas, which is an ethnographic data set, a pretty amazing ethnographic data set, on the historical living conditions of about 1,200 ethnic groups prior to industrialization. So this is a data set that was constructed by an anthropologist called George Peter Murdoch, who basically assembled a huge number of ethnographies from different ethnographers who had visited these ethnic groups and compiled them into a single database. Right, so you can think of the 1700s, the 1800s as a time where many ethnographers, where many adventurers visited ethnic groups around the globe, and they came home, they returned some writings about the local living conditions, the local circumstances. George Peter Murdoch assembled those and put them into a database. And now what's going to be interesting for our purposes here is that this database, among other things, contains very rich information. Because anthropologists care so much about extended family ties, it contains rich information about the local kinship system. Did people marry their cousins? Did they live with their parents after marriage? Do they associate with clans? And so on. So we're just going to use these data to construct an index, again, some continuum between 0 and 1 that tells us were these ethno-linguistic groups primarily tight in terms of their kinship relationships or primarily loose. So this is the historical variation you see in this data set, where red means relatively tight extended kinship relations, and blue means relatively loose. Now, notice, of course, these are historical populations. So, for example, these would be Native American groups that were visited by adventurers or ethnographers in the relatively early days. So now you may ask, well, how does this variation, this historical variation in extended kinship relations, how does that help us to understand the variation in universalist versus particularist morality that we observe around the globe today? And that's basically the question that my paper was devoted to. And as I said, I'm only going to show you one figure from this paper, which is this one here, a cross-country correlation, and then I'll explain to you, how we go deeper than just this cross-country correlation. But basically what you see here is this index that I've shown to you on the previous slide, the ancestral kinship tightness index, on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, a cross-country measure of how universalist is that society on average. So you see a massive negative correlation between the two at the country level. And then in the paper, much of the work is about trying to convince you that this isn't an artifact of the cross-country correlation, but that instead we can also twist the data in much more fine-grained, much richer ways by leveraging variation, not just across country, but also across individuals that live in the same country but originate from different ethnic groups. And so then, because what's important to recognize here is this variation here is not across countries; it's across different ethno-linguistic groups. So what you can essentially do is you can compare individuals who live in the same country today, but they are descendants from different historical ethno-linguistic groups. And then this historical measure of kinship tightness even allows us to compare two individuals who live in the same country today but have different ethnic backgrounds, and that allows us to predict it.
Good evening. Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. That testimony concerned in part a multi-year project to renovate historic Federal Reserve office buildings. I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight rule. The Fed, through testimony and other public disclosures, made every effort to keep Congress informed about the renovation project. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I have served at the Federal Reserve under 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike. In every case, I have carried out my duties without political fear or favor, focused solely on our mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people. Thank you.
就是立冬。 骨头。我觉得这两天我有点尴尬，一个原因是因为我不知道，那个 econometric 的那个 group，然后是 STEM group。I really don't know that. I feel like they should change the new group, so to say. And another problem is that the same guest speaker from last year came again. It's for Hanishi during the class, and that's really. 而且非常的 neutralized。然后，对，就 VCB 那小单位，我的天，各处都是心机，我也不是很愿意 exposure myself。买了 great VCB 的 guest speaker， 我的天。OK。 这个厉害。OK guys， 我们要关闭直播了，然后现在时间是3332232324。我们要把时间写在这个 iPad Pro 上面。然后今天我要不要去买蛋糕？这是一个问题，因为我还有 extra €5 and 100. So 我们今天没有 prepare the macro analysis. 我überhaupt meine Gedanken cannot bring into this kind of competition flow. So doesn't really matter if you have the sufficient battery. You can just copy the answer. And yeah, just do a fast preview. And yeah. And the development economics we have prepared, and I have I have inserted the document into the FastPath. So so once it's necessary, we can just use a small iPad to open it, and that's why it's fine. So now is that time to record the time point for now. And so we should take care about not to be killed in 1 single second, and influence session, and so that yeah, and okay, so 334553. I really don't have anything to pay back to your to ask little brother, and the reason is that they could potentially have everything and etc. What they want, and so yeah, if that's referring who is gonna invite to the person who actually I'm not very like this kind of person who speaks, and this week the yellow this person, this author, like together with what is Kowalski has worked. I really just read his name about several times. I really don't care about that. The reason is those kind of European economists and really cannot drive my interests. And so even that and this kind of yellow, I really don't know is what. And so fine, let's close the study live stream, and so see you guys in the next one, and keep healthy, keep follow my YouTube study live stream. And today we left the macro preview and macro exercise preview, and afternoon we're gonna go to the PC pool and to do the macro analysis House of Garden. And yeah, I can request it to one of my group meet leader and ask them whether I can add my means on. But I only have 2 publications, so that I really couldn't. And and so otherwise there are nothing new. And the Miko quiz is gonna soon come, and after when I feel like angry and etc. Another problem is that there is no problem anymore. I should submit the PowerPoint for next week, and in 2 days, so to say. And otherwise, yeah, otherwise everything's new, everything's well, and so. And we should take care about the Gabriele Ziegler, because he is one copy my name characters person at university. It's very obvious to see recently is that also in the people socials has they did this second tenor professor thing, and etc. has also the same name character with me. I'm really annoyed about that, because the reason is my name is not that cheap, and I really don't want to match those. So that's why. Okay, fine. So let's close the study live stream. See you guys next one. Bye. And we should pay attention to about to avoid the bank account, etc. So we wait like 50, 40 seconds and you are to close the Livestream. And also the time point was so wrong because that is 6 after 9. Today before the class we should buy a cup of coffee, but I really got the period so to say the and so that I feel like devastating. I really want to have break and not to go to university. So do my co-presenter Emil and yeah. So but I still need struggle go to and then oh, I'm sorry. Today is not Marco exercise. Sorry, I really thought that wrong, and it is econometric analysis. This is more or less easy because already I can can also lernen by several PowerPoints, like the non-parametric identities in the parametric method, for example, and yeah, okay, so let's just close the session and dream. See you guys then. Bye. I have a sufficient day. OK，3397340340。